Thank you all so much for joining us. I am so glad to see each and every one of you here and safe and hopefully comfortable and really well situated for tonight's program. My name is Amy Carpenter, and I am the Special Projects Coordinator and Communications Associate for the Kentucky Resources Council. KRC is a nonprofit and nonpartisan group of lawyers, policy experts, and advocates fighting for environmental justice all across the state of Kentucky. While most of our time is spent in the courtroom demanding a healthier Kentucky, tonight we are here and very happy to be with you and our esteemed speaker, Ron Eller. Now, I'm sure you all are familiar with Ron, but just a little bit about our speaker for tonight. Ron is originally from Southern West Virginia and has spent more than 40 years writing and teaching about the Appalachian region. He is a descendant of 8 generations of families from Appalachia, and Dr. Eller served for 15 years as the director of the University of Kentucky Appalachian Center. As a former Rockefeller Foundation Scholar, he also holds a Ph.D. from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Ron has published more than 60 articles and reports, but is most well known for his award-winning books, Miners, Mill Hands, and Mountaineers, The Industrialization of the Appalachian South, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in 1983, and Uneven Ground, Appalachia since 1945. Ron has also served as chairman of the Governor's Kentucky Appalachian Task Force, the first chairman of the Kentucky Appalachian Commission, a member of the Sustainable Communities Task Force of President Clinton's Council on Sustainable Development. Ron has won numerous awards and honors, and Dr. Eller's most recent book, Uneven Ground, Appalachia since 1945, was the winner of the 2008 Willis D. Weatherford Award for the best publication about Appalachia by the Appalachian Studies Association, and the 2009 VO Key Award for the best book on Southern politics by the Southern Political Science Association. And there's many more wonderful things to know about Ron, and I'm sure I have left many out because how can you say everything in 30 seconds? But with all of that being said, I am going to go ahead and stop talking and turn it over to the reason that you're all here tonight to learn and be with us, and that is Ron Eller.
Thank you, Amy. I appreciate that very much. My goal this evening is to provide you with a bit of an overview about the history of the region, focusing as much as I can on the environmental history of the region. I've struggled with this a little bit this evening because some members of the council, and I hope they will come, participated in a lot of what I'm going to be talking about this evening. And some folks like Joe Childers and Fitz know a lot more than I do about some of these topics. But others may not be as familiar with the history of Eastern Kentucky and the history of Appalachia in general. And so I'm going to try and, as briefly as possible, condense what I used to teach. I've been retired now for 10 years. What I used to teach in 2 full semester classes into a brief presentation focusing on the environment. The roots of environmental injustice in Appalachia. I wish I could say that I could just go back a few decades and we could start there, but I really feel like I need to go a little bit deeper into the history of the region in order to understand what we're going to focus on primarily at the end of the presentation. There are 2 things that I hope you'll keep in mind as I'm going through this discussion of the region's history. One, I think it's critically important to try and move beyond a lot of the images and stereotypes that we all have, those of us from the region and those not from Appalachia. The stereotypes and images that have for so long restricted our understanding of mountain communities as part of a larger system. it's impossible to understand Appalachia in a piecemeal kind of fashion in the way that lots of media folk tend to focus on just housing or just education or just politics. At the foundation of understanding Appalachia, of course, is the environment. The land itself has shaped the region's history and has influenced all of the other aspects of Appalachian society in some rather dramatic kinds of ways. What happens on the environment affects everything all the way down and including our culture. Appalachia is no different from other societies in that respect. How we use the land, as most of you are familiar, shapes who we are and shapes our politics and environment. The second thing that I hope that you will think about is that Appalachia is not the land where time stood still, but in fact is a place that has undergone the same forces of change as the rest of America. Prior to about 5 decades ago, there was no history of this region. There was no history of Appalachia written by scholars who have attempted to understand what's happened in the mountains. And the assumptions were that nothing ever happened in the mountains. As a result, Appalachia became over time seen within the American consciousness as the other America, something strange and different. Usually folks blamed either the land itself as isolating people or the culture of the mountains as being problem of the region. One of the first folks that I am aware of that really began to challenge that image of Appalachia was Harry Caudill. Most of you know the name Harry Caudill, a lawyer from Whitesburg who wrote Night Comes to the Cumberlands in 1962. And Harry was one of the first people who argued that Appalachia in many ways is a mirror to America. What happened and happens in Appalachia eventually is going to reflect the larger society. I think we need to understand that Appalachia is not the other America as the popular stereotypes would have it, but in fact is part and parcel to our understanding of our larger society, including the Commonwealth. The mountains are a place also of significant diversity in class and race and ethnicity. Again, the stereotypes of Appalachia as the home of Anglo-Saxon Protestants or pure Scotch-Irish folk narrows our understanding of the region and its history, and it is quite inaccurate historically just as much as it is inaccurate today. Perhaps the best way to understand what has happened in Appalachia is to see Appalachia as one of America's resource colonies, a place of tremendous wealth, but a place that has been drained of its wealth, both by outside corporate interests and by elites, local and state elites, who have played a significant role in that exploitation. Back in the 1960s, when I began a lot of my work, it was the tendency to want to see the problems of the mountains as being created by these outside interests only interested in the natural resources of the mountains. But over the last 5 decades, we've come to realize that local people, folks in Louisville and Lexington, as well as in the urban areas of eastern Kentucky, have also played an important role in the evolution of that story. And finally, we need to see Appalachia as a place that has experienced growth without development. One of the things that I worked a lot in the 1990s with Jess White, who was chairman of the Appalachian Regional Commission. And Jess used to try and point out the difference between growth and development to the region's governors. Growth can be growth in terms of job creation, but without development of the institutional capacity to sustain people over a longer period of time. That development means improvements in the quality of life, education, healthcare, housing, and the like. Appalachia has experienced a great deal of growth, but only limited development. Now, there really are four eras of change in the history of the mountains, and I'm going to focus just a little bit on the first two and focus primarily on the last two periods of change. The pre-colonial period of Appalachia prior to the coming of European to the region, the pre-industrial, or what some people call the classical period of Appalachia, small farms and independent communities, and then the industrial period, the turn of the 20th century, when things changed so dramatically within the region, the way of life changed, land ownership patterns changed, and the region became what we commonly know as modern Appalachia. And then since 1945, we've seen another period of transition with the growth of federal programs, changes in the structure of the coal industry, and the like. Prior to the coming of Europeans to the region, the mountains were one of the world's richest biodiverse ecosystems, a region of tremendous wealth, tremendous diversity, matched only perhaps by the Amazon and the tremendous diversity of the Amazon, walnuts and oaks, trees, pure streams. It was a region hardly changed from its natural state by the native residents of the region, at least until the time of the Revolutionary War, which this map is a map from 1772. It demonstrates that most of central Appalachia and almost all of eastern Kentucky was yet unsettled by Europeans and Africans, was an area occupied by small communities of Indians, Native Americans, but most of the region in East Kentucky was a common hunting ground for others, and it had been its environment had been changed very little. With the arrival of European settlers in the region, we see Appalachia reflecting much of what was characteristic of the American frontier at that time. From about 1790, from the start of the new republic on through the 19th century, Appalachia was characterized by open country, small homestead settlements. Large communities were relatively few. People lived on small farms, 300 to 500 acres, and developed a particular kind of economy that reflected their cultural needs, which were primarily the family and the needs of the community. Appalachians during much of the 19th century tended not to engage in row crop agriculture, but to live on what modern scientists call woodlands agriculture, lived in conjunction with the surrounding woods, running cattle and sheep and hogs and other products, using the products of the woods, growing large vegetable gardens, and trading among themselves within family groups and small communities. A very different outlook on the economy, an outlook on how the land was to be used than what was emerging back in the eastern United States, when the land was increasingly seen as something to produce a product that would in turn produce cash or produce capital. The land for most of the 19th century, for most Appalachians, there were some exceptions, but most Appalachians considered the land to be the essence of sustainability for the family, rather than something that would make individuals rich and profitable. Woodlands agriculture, of course, meant that the woods themselves were utilized and used, but not overutilized. The impact of woodlands agriculture in the mountains as late as the 1880s and 1890s was to leave most of the major hardwood timber there. Mountain families cut timber for their own particular use, and on occasions by the 1880s were floating logs down the larger rivers to markets for additional income. But the impact of woodlands agriculture on the land was minimal. to a great degree because of, again, this cultural value system that existed in the region. Much of the land was considered to be commons, although large sections of East Kentucky were in fact owned by residents from East Virginia and other places in the eastern part of the United States. The land itself was not used in a different kind of way. The land was considered to be commons, open to use by anyone as long as they didn't abuse it. And the regulation of that local commons area was done primarily by the local community. The notion of the commons is an important aspect of Appalachian history and an important value system that lasted well into the 20th century, but is something that has increasingly been impacted by the rise of industrialization in the region. The transition in the mountains that changed the region the most was the coming of industrialization in the years after the Civil War into the early part of the 20th century. That process began in the 1880s with the arrival of railroads, which cut into the region primarily because of the growing demand for the products of the mountains, the timber, and the coal, and the other resources of the region by an industrializing society outside of the mountains. This map gives you a little bit of an idea of the extent to which railroads penetrated the mountains at the turn of the 20th century. Almost every mountain county had some kind of a main line, or if not a main line, a spur line into its county by the turn of the 20th century. The arrival of railroads brought a new kind of consumer culture, a new kind of value system, larger numbers of population, and changed the way the land was used. These are images from East Kentucky of land use around the turn of the 20th century. What happened to the forests that we saw a minute ago? Large timber corporations from Michigan and Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, acquired acreages of land in central Appalachia, brought in railroad spurs and cut over the timber, or in some cases paid 50 cents a foot across the trunk to local farmers for their timber, and then hired the local farmers on to cut the timber off. My grandparents participated in the great timber boom in Appalachia, living in North Carolina, and helped to cut over most of the timber from the Black and the Blue Ridge region there before becoming coal miners in southern West Virginia. These are images from eastern Kentucky. Quite a bit of difference in terms of the impact on land after the coming of the timber industry than the traditional Appalachian homesteads. The arrival of the timber industry and of the railroads also did a couple of other things. One, by shifting the nature of the economy increasingly to outside and dependence on outside products, we began to see around the 1890s mountain farms abandoning woodlands agriculture as the woodlands are cut over and are no longer available, and beginning to cut up the hillsides of their own farms, obviously opening up to land destruction and to the loss of topsoil and the like in the region, as farmers increasingly become dependent upon acquisition of cash. This picture on the left also includes something else that occurred in the 1880s and 1890s, and that was the arrival of mineral men, as they were called in the mountains, folks who began to come into the region and acquire the resources, whether that be coal or timber or other natural resources from the local people. And in the process, we began to see a major transition in not only land ownership, but a transition in political power as well. This period of land change and land acquisition included two kinds of land buyers. There were outsiders, many former officers, Civil War officers, who rode through the mountains acquiring land for banking corporations and other investors in the eastern part of the United States who anticipated the demand for coal and timber. And then there were also homegrown land agents who literally would begin to acquire land from their neighbors and put it together into large chunks of land that they would then in turn sell to the outside corporate interests. One of these local landowners, local land speculators, of course, was John C.C. Mayo of Prestonsburg, a local school teacher who began acquiring land around Prestonsburg, anticipating the arrival of railroads and coal, became not only the largest landholder in the state of Kentucky himself, but eventually the wealthiest person in the state of Kentucky, in selling the land to external interests. The other thing that others in Kentucky participated in this process. Henry Watterson from Louisville was a major promoter of resources from the Appalachian region and a promoter of what came to be called the New South Creed, that the South would rise again by tapping into its natural resources and to its wealth and become rich and would rise again. Other investors, such as the Breckenridges and the Foxes from Lexington, also were responsible for investing in railroads and other places. So it wasn't just the outside corporations that came in purchasing the land, but it was also the role of the middle class and Commonwealth that played a pretty important aspect of this development as well. Two types of purchase agreements that transitioned the mountains during this period. Obviously, one fee simple, buying the surface land itself. But John C.C. Mayo developed another form of land acquisition called the broad form deed, in which he learned he simply acquired the mineral rights to the minerals below, paying local landowners enough to pay taxes or to send their son or daughter away to school, or even less in many cases, just for the rights to the coal below. It didn't seem to be much of an issue in the 1890s to the landowners who sold the land, but by later on, especially after World War II, when we have the ability to surface mine the land and remove the surface in order to get at those minerals, the broad form deed allowed access to the minerals by any means necessary. It was interesting to me, and I used to tell my students that I read lots of diaries from the mountains in the 1870s and 80s, and they always talked, and newspaper articles always talked about how friendly mountain people were. You'd be invited into their home and provided a meal and a place to sleep for the evening. But by the turn of the 20th century, those same newspaper articles and letters began to talk about how hostile the mountain people are and how they would be greeted with a shotgun at the door as often as they would be with a hello when they were touring in the region. So mineral buyers eventually became suspect in the region, but by the turn of the century, upwards of 80%, 90% of the surface land and mineral rights in many East Kentucky and West Virginia counties had been purchased by outsiders. Land ownership and control of the land is a major issue in the environmental history of Appalachia. One of the other aspects that we should point out is that of all of the Appalachian coal fields, East Kentucky was the last of the region's coal fields to be developed. The development began first in West Virginia and Alabama and Tennessee, and only about the turn of the 20th century did development come to Eastern Kentucky. That meant that Eastern Kentucky followed a slightly different pattern of economic development with the coming of coal than did other areas. The typical patterns, as you can see, ran from small owner operators initially to, after World War II, international energy conglomerates owning the corporations. But in Eastern Kentucky, you had a larger percentage of corporate and captive mines established by Ford Motor Company, International Harvester, U.S. Steel, who came into the region acquiring coal mines and coal that would be shipped specifically for the production of steel back north. Many of these corporate and captive mines produced a kind of a model community that we'll talk about in a minute. Very typical, however, of this era of coal development, which scholars call the hand-loading era, was the development of an entirely new and different way of life, dependent upon outside goods coming in, the company store, hard work, and tremendous population gain and increase in the region. I have a few pictures from East Kentucky that describe some of these early coal camps and conditions in which people moved from the family farms into the region. Population increased dramatically at the turn of the century, not only from folks from one part of the mountains moving into the coal counties of Eastern Kentucky and southern West Virginia, but also immigrants from New York City, having freshly arrived from Ellis Island, African Americans from Virginia, South Carolina, and especially from Alabama who came in to work in the region. The region's population more than tripled overnight. At one point in time, Harlan was the second largest city in the state of Kentucky. The percentage of communities established throughout these coalfield areas was rather dramatic. There were 100 coal communities for every single incorporated individual community in the mountains. There were 100 coal communities. Some of them were company towns created by the larger corporations, the captive mines, larger houses than what we saw earlier. This is a Harlan County community. You can see the mostly built along the bottoms of the valleys, along the creeks. You begin to see the hillsides and how devastated. The initial companies had to come in, and if the timber companies hadn't cut the timber, the coal companies cut the timber to build the company houses, as you can see. Often with the creek running down the middle of the community. My wife wanted me to be sure to include this picture. Although it's a model company town, you can see the issues related to water quality, the impact of large concentrations of populations without adequate infrastructure and sewer systems, what the impact of that was on the streams. I'm a fisherman, have been a fisherman since I was a little boy. And my grandfather used to tell me about the quality of the fishing in the region, and the fish that were there almost disappeared by the late 20s and into the 30s because of the heavy industrialization in the region. My wife also wanted me to include this picture, an example of not only the living facilities as a result in the coal communities, but disposal of waste and its impact on water quality and health standards. The U.S. Coal Commission, established by the Senate in the 1920s to look at the conditions in America's coal mines, declared that the coal mining communities of central Appalachia were the worst working and living conditions for any working class Americans in the United States, and documented quite extensively the level of living conditions, health hazards, water quality that existed at that time in the 20s and 30s. The coal boom lasted into the 1920s. But very quickly, and as I indicated earlier, Kentucky's development came at the end of the coal boom. It competed with coal mines in Pennsylvania and West Virginia, and Virginia especially, for markets in the north. The industry was tremendously overexpanded at that time. Over 500 coal miners worked in central Appalachia, producing more coal than the nation could consume. The first sign of collapse of that industry came in 1923, and then an entire collapse of the industry in 1927. Appalachia entered the Great Depression years before the rest of the country did, and by the time the Great Depression came along in 1929, the number of active working coal miners had halved. Many of those who had migrated into the region from the Deep South and other places moved further north to try and find employment in the industrial centers of the Midwest and Northeast. I included this map to the right on this slide, largely because I wanted to point out the difference between the coal fields and the non-coal fields of Appalachia. Beginning in the late 20s, we began to see the creation of national forests in Appalachia after the first cutover of the Appalachian forest by the forest industry. And you'll see that large areas of the Blue Ridge and other parts of Appalachia were included in the national forests. You'll also notice the large gap here in the coal fields. Because of the coal industry, because of land ownership patterns, we tended not to get creation of national forests in the region, which did in other areas provided for public management of the forests, and which made a difference for the economic development of those areas over time. World War II brought about the final transition, I think, in the change from the classical Appalachian environment. The war itself brought a brief recovery of the coal industry, the demand for coal, for more production, but it also meant, since many of the men were away at war, increased mechanization of that coal industry, which laid off further thousands of men and did not provide the employment for men when they came back from the war. Thousands of mountain men, in fact, a higher percentage of men from Appalachia served in the military during the war than any other region of the country. Many mountain women left the region to work in war industries in the Midwest and the Northeast. One of the funny stories is that some of you may remember Eula Hall with the Mud Creek Health Clinic in Floyd County. Eula, at the age of 16, was recruited out of her community to go to Massachusetts to work in a textile mill making uniforms. And being a good mountain girl, when she got up there, Eula found that conditions weren't quite to her liking, and so she started organizing a union. She immediately got fired and sent back to East Kentucky. But the war itself brought many mountain residents who had never been out of their home county into contact with other areas of the nation, raising expectations of what life might be like for them after the war. In the 1940s, late 40s, and 1950s, however, Appalachia suffered from high rates of unemployment, massive outmigration to the Midwest. Some 3.3 million people left East Kentucky and West Virginia to migrate into the industrial Midwest. Hard times, unemployment, and struggles. The war also brought something else. It brought a change in the coal industry itself and the introduction of the modern era of coal mining. At the end of the war, there was a great deal of wartime equipment left over at the end of the war, and the government wanted to get rid of a lot of the loading machines and trucks and other kind of equipment that had been used during the war, and so auctioned it off at very low prices. As a result, entrepreneurs from East Kentucky could buy at auction a front-end loader and a truck and maybe a bulldozer at government surplus and open up their own small mine. And what ended up happening was that they could acquire a lease or even rights to a seam of coal along the spurs of the ridge and simply go in and dig it out, load it into a truck, and ship it to a rail station. Simultaneously, at the end of the war, the Tennessee Valley Authority, in order to meet growing American demand for electricity, decided to build a series of coal-fired generating plants and to use this cheap surface mine coal to support it. In many ways, then, the government, in the form of TVA, underwrote the development of a competing industry to deep mining, and that was the emergence of surface mining, which dramatically changed both the land and society of Central Appalachia. These images from the 1950s and 1960s, on the left, you see the high walls. Those of us who grew up in the mountains in the 50s and 60s remember miles and miles and miles of high walls, of strips where it was easy for the bulldozers to get in, cut out the coal, and ship it off to the TVA. On the right and in the middle, you see examples of auger mines, the use of big augers, which simply drilled into the side of the mountain to drill out the coal. And many of us remember miles and miles of these strips of high walls. When it rained, the water and the slides fell down the mountain, polluting the streams and getting into nearby water supplies. I had to include this image simply because it was in the 1950s that a very strong relationship developed between the coal industry and government, both state and local government. Of course, the industry had developed that prior to World War II, but the character and nature of industrial development with the emergence of strip mining even strongly reinforced that relationship that existed between those who held the political authority in communities and those who managed and controlled the jobs. And that played a major role in events of the 1960s and 70s and 80s, and even one might argue to the present. One of the byproducts of the industrialization of the region, especially from strip mining, of course, was the increase in flooding in the mountains. Floods have always been an issue in the mountains. We've always had floods back as far as anyone in recorded history can remember, until the destruction of the woodlands, until the destruction of the sides of the mountains from strip mining. However, those floods did not produce the levels of damage that they began to produce in the 1950s, especially the flood of 1957, which is these are the images from the 1957 flood, which killed 9 people and was the largest flood of its kind in East Kentucky up to that point. The floods coming to the mountains, the high levels of unemployment began to press a lot of mountain leaders and folks across the state into trying to do something for East Kentucky to turn the region around. Burt Combs from East Kentucky ran for governor in 1960 on a program called Program 60, in which he proposed to bring infrastructure into the region and to address some of the issues of unemployment and massive flooding and the problems of the mountains. And as governor, he organized something called the Council of Appalachian Governors, because other Appalachian states were experiencing the same kinds of issues and problems as Kentucky. As a result, began to pressure the federal government, first John Kennedy and then Lyndon Johnson, for federal resources to address the problems of the region. Lyndon Johnson, of course, came to East Kentucky in 1964 in his announcement of his effort to eliminate poverty across America. His trip to Martin County was a symbolic importance in that Appalachia played a central role in the evolution of the war on poverty. There were 2 elements in the war on poverty affecting the region, 2 dual strategies that are important to talk about. One was the Office of Economic Opportunity, which was designed to develop the human capacity of the region, focusing on people, on creating job training programs and a self-help program through the creation of community action councils in communities. And the second was picking up on Burt Combs's and other governors' efforts to improve infrastructure, was the creation of the Appalachian Regional Commission in 1965. This sort of split approach created some real challenges within the region. The OEO, of course, disappeared in the early 70s, but the ARC survives to this point. But they both reflect the focus of the time that poverty was either an individual problem, a problem of a people's culture, a culture of poverty, or it was a physical problem in that people simply didn't have the same kind of amenities and connections that other parts of the country had, because the mountains isolated people from the region, and so we needed to improve physical capacity. Neither of these approaches in the war on poverty tended to focus on issues of land ownership and land use or environmental quality. While the war on poverty did a great deal to improve conditions in the region, and I think we need to keep that in mind, it also failed fundamentally to address many of the underlying issues that had created the conditions in the mountains to begin with. Because of the disappointment with and frustrations with the war on poverty and other great society efforts, there emerged in the mountains in the 1960s into the 1970s a rather remarkable rise of resistance by local people, by folks who had come into the region as poverty warriors to help fight the war on poverty, and increasingly realized that the problem wasn't so much the culture of the people as it was the political economy in which people lived. And throughout the 1960s, a wide range of very important groups emerged in eastern Kentucky to address some of these challenges, especially to protest the persistence of surface mining. It wasn't until 1977, long after the war on poverty itself ended, that we finally got an act addressing surface mining nationally. The Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act, 1977, was the first act that really provided some federal influence on surface mining, required surface mining permits, set up the Federal Office of Surface Mining to supervise state reclamation programs. Sadly, the 1977 Act was a compromise bill signed by President Carter. It had been vetoed twice by Gerald Ford, but signed by President Carter in order to get something on the table. Much to the chagrin of activists in eastern Kentucky, the Surface Mining Control Act failed to abolish surface mining in favor of regulating surface mining in order to create these regulatory structures both at the state and federal level. It established the principle of land should be restored to its approximate original contour. This, of course, is possible in Illinois and Indiana, parts of Wyoming and Montana and Ohio. It's pretty impossible to restore a mountain to its approximate original contour. Activists in eastern Kentucky recognized also that surface mining had a great deal of other complications in terms of healthcare and health status of people. And when the National Sierra Club decided that it would join the compromise bill, it alienated a lot of activists in Kentucky, and surface mining continued in central Appalachia. It did establish the federal state surface mining and reclamation practices. It failed to eliminate the broad form deed, however, which continued to be supported by court decision after court decision in Kentucky. In terms of our impact in the present, it also provided a bit of a loophole that allowed for the rise of mountaintop removal practices of surface mining, which we face today. This is a map of surface mining in central Appalachia. You can see the extent of surface mining, nearly 1.2 million acres, an area as large as the state of Delaware. Appalachian Voices, an activist organization headed by Harvard Ayers out of North Carolina, commissioned a study in 2009 that showed nearly 1.2 million acres had been surface mined for coal, and more than 500 mountains destroyed by mountaintop removal coal mining. In some counties, such as Wise County, Virginia, surface mining had impacted nearly 40% of the land. I wanted to share with you this chart. Shows that almost 300 mountains were leveled in Kentucky as of 2009. Of course, the practice continues today. That's the largest number of mountains destroyed by mountaintop removal in the Appalachian region. These are aerial maps of Letcher County in 2004 and 2016 after the impact of major surface mining efforts. I won't go into detail. I've got dozens and dozens and dozens of these slides that I used to share with students about mountaintop removal. I'll share just a couple of them with you. Most of you are probably familiar and have seen these slides of what happens to a mountain in the process of removing the coal. As you can see here, the process itself, deep mines, of course, the drift mines would run a shaft into the mountain to get this seam of coal. After World War II, the strip mining, auger mines and things began cutting into these benches along the top of the ridges But mountaintop removal process, of course, takes the overburden or the spoil, as they call it, and dumps it into the valley below after removing all of the forests. And then the end product creates a plateau-like area. And of course, early advocates argued that, well, the problem with the mountains is the mountains, not enough land for development, can't build factories, can't employ people. And so surface mining, strip mining, especially mountaintop removal, will create flat land. This is what parts of East Kentucky north of Hazard look like today. It's very difficult in many ways, if you do much driving in the mountains, to see the mountaintop removal site. These sites are often removed far from populated centers and off the main roads. You have to fly over the region to get a real sense for what has happened in the mountains. And this site here gives you a pretty good example of that. I wanted to include this largely because one of the arguments that's frequently utilized to encourage mountaintop removal, and the loophole, by the way, in the SMACRA Act was that one would not have to restore to original contour if one could document, improve, and plan for a higher and better use of the land after mining. This is not coal. This is spoil. This is valley fill. And you can see, it's a loose substance. These flat plateaus are notorious for settling. They're unstable. It's rather difficult to build any kind of heavy structure on these facilities, and almost impossible to restore any kind of woodland. There have been some successful efforts, but by and large, most of the land has been utilized now as for wildlife preservation, open fields. I was on this particular site when they introduced elk to it north of Hazard in the early 90s. But the greatest impact of mountaintop removal is on the communities. Poisoned drinking water from all kinds of things that filter out of the ground, blasting flying rock, flooding, of course, as a result of the inability of the vegetation to sustain the water, toxic sludge impoundments, such as the one that gave way up in Martin County a few years ago and flooded an entire community there. Limits on economic development, not only because of the instability of the structures themselves, but because of access to infrastructure. You have to build infrastructure into it, roads into it, and frequently these locations are far removed from population centers. Population decline has continued to decline in eastern Kentucky as people, in many cases, are forced to leave from these communities. And of course, health risks. Since 2007, peer-reviewed studies by researchers from more than a dozen universities have concluded that mountaintop removal coal mining contributes to significantly higher rates of birth defects, cancer, cardiovascular, and respiratory diseases among individuals living in the region where mining occurs. And these studies, by the way, have done comparative studies with mountain communities side by side, those that have lived next to a MTR site versus those who do not. And the instances of cancer and cardiovascular disease are consistently higher in those areas close to the mining sites. And of course, to conclude, last year, we saw the ultimate impact of climate change on the mountains and what it continues to do in mountain communities. The most severe impact of flooding we have had, killing 38 people in East Kentucky. And this is downtown Jackson. This, of course, is Hindman. It's interesting how the media has, in my opinion, neglected to place much of an impact upon mountaintop removal and what we've done to the landscape and its impact upon these sudden rising floods and the expectation that we're going to have more because of land ownership issues, where people can live, what kind of housing has been made available to people, as well as what we've done to the environment. If you're interested in mountaintop removal and current issues, You might go to Appalachian Voices, appvoices.org. This is their report that I cited here, Communities at Risk for Mountaintop Removal. It's one of the best resources that I'm aware of on what's going on in East Kentucky today. Additional resources on the history of the region and what I've described. Of course, Harry Caudill's classic Night Comes to the Cumberlands. His book, My Land is Dying, focuses specifically on strip mining and what was happening in East Kentucky in the early 60s as a result of the introduction of strip mining. And my book, Miners, Mill Hands, and Mountaineers, sort of expands Night Comes to the Cumberlands to the larger region and points out that these events occurred not only in East Kentucky, but West Virginia, Tennessee, and other areas of Appalachia. My most recent book, Uneven Ground, focuses primarily on government policy toward the region since 1945 and points out that to this point, both of the major strategies to quote unquote develop Appalachia have pretty much failed in their efforts. Both the free market capitalism of the turn of the 20th century, when industry came into the region and transformed life dramatically, and the post-World War II public investment of money in the region, either in terms of transfer payments or resources that primarily have improved the quality of life for the mountain middle class. And we see that in many places in the region, but has done little to level the playing ground among the poor and the middle class in the region. Uneven Ground suggests that those previous efforts to address Appalachian issues have failed to address the structural problems of land distribution and use, political corruption, environmental exploitation, income inequality, and economic dependency.
Thank you so much for all of you for joining us here tonight and pursuing more knowledge about such an important topic to such a wonderful place that we call home. I encourage you all to please continue to engage with KRC. Look into future events that we're doing, like our July webinar with environmental reporter Jim Bruggers. Donate to support our legal advocacy work and protection of Kentucky at kyrc.org. To purchase Ron's book, Uneven Ground, visit your local independent bookseller or your friendly library. And until we see you again, please stay informed, stay empowered, and stay well. I hope you all have a wonderful night.